The air at the Miller Farm auction hung thick and heavy, smelling of diesel exhaust, damp earth, and desperation. It was the autumn of 1973, and while the price of corn was good, Old Man Miller had chased it too hard, bought a new combine he couldn't afford, and the bank had finally called his note. Now his life's work was being picked apart by his neighbors, piece by rusty piece. I stood near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my canvas work coat, just watching. I wasn't there to buy much. Maybe a set of wrenches or a spare tire that might fit my old grain truck. My farm, the one my father had carved out of the Iowa soil, was small, but it was mine. Every tractor, every plow, every bolt was paid for in cash and sweat. That's when they dragged it out. It wasn't a tractor or a combine. It was a monster. An Alice Chalmers HD-11 crawler, a bulldozer from a time when steel was thick and men were expected to be tougher than the machines they ran. It was a 10-ton slab of faded yellow iron, its tracks caked with years of dried mud and its massive blade scarred with the gouges of 1,000 rocks. The straight-six diesel engine was half disassembled, its cylinder head sitting crooked on the block, draped in a greasy tarp. One of the massive hydraulic cylinders that lifted the blade was weeping a slow, black tear of fluid down its pitted chrome shaft. A low murmur went through the crowd. Most were farmers, men who understood the language of horsepower and hydraulics. They saw a dead machine, a yard ornament, a $1,000 problem that would cost $5,000 to fix. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Clyde, tried his best. "All right, boys, here she is, a real earth mover. Needs a little TLC, a little love, but there's good iron here. Who'll start the bidding at $500? $500 for this magnificent machine." Silence. A few men chuckled and shook their heads. That's when Russell Thorne stepped forward. Russ was everything I wasn't. He was young, loud, and farmed 1,000 acres he'd leveraged himself to the eyeballs to acquire. He drove a brand-new Ford F-250 Ranger, the fancy one with the two-tone paint, and his fields were worked by a fleet of shiny new John Deere green that still had the dealer's sticker on the window. He was the poster boy for the new way of farming. Borrow big, expand fast, and pray the prices stayed high. He walked right up to the Dozer and gave one of the tracks a kick with his immaculate boot. $500? He laughed, turning to the crowd. "Clyde, you ought to pay someone $500 just to haul this pile of scrap to the foundry. The engine's shot, the undercarriage is worn to nubs, and she's been sitting so long the birds have built a nest in the radiator." He wasn't wrong. I could see from where I stood that the track pins were so worn they were sloppy in the bushings. The sprockets were hooked, sharpened to points like a shark's teeth from years of grinding against the chain. An undercarriage job on a machine that size would cost a fortune in parts alone. But I saw something else. I saw a straight frame. I saw a blade that wasn't cracked or bent, just scarred. And I saw the unmistakable shape of a Detroit diesel engine under that tarp. A two-stroke screamer, loud, leaky, and cantankerous, but if you could get one running, it would run on just about anything and pull until the world split in two. My dad had run an old Oliver with a Detroit in it, and the sound of that engine at full throttle was burned into my memory. Russ looked over the crowd, his eyes landing on me. A smirk played on his lips. "Jedediah," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This looks like it's right up your alley. Probably fits right in with that museum you call a farm." The laughter was scattered but sharp. He was talking about my tractors. My 1951 Farmall M, the one I used for planting. My John Deere 4020, a 68 model, which was my newest and biggest tractor. They were old, but they were mine. I knew every gear, every grease zerk, every quirk. When they broke, I didn't call a dealer. I split them in half myself on the concrete floor of my barn. I didn't say anything, I just kept my eyes on the Dozer. All right, Clyde the auctioneer said, trying to regain control. "Let's be serious. Who'll give me $100? $100, boys. We're selling it for scrap value." A man from the local junkyard raised a finger. $100, he grunted. "I got $100. Who'll give $150? Silence. The junkyard man was going to get it. He'd cut it up with a torch and haul it away in pieces. The thought of that magnificent broken-down beast being turned into rebar sent a strange pang through my gut. It was a relic of a tougher time, and it deserved a better end. Without thinking, I raised my hand. 200, I said. My voice was quiet, but in the sudden lull it sounded like a gunshot. Every head turned to me. Russ Thorne's smirk widened into a full-blown grin of disbelief. He looked at me, then at the Dozer, and let out a loud theatrical laugh. "Well, I'll be," he boomed. "Jed Stone's buying himself a new anchor for his sinking ship. Don't you know you're supposed to put the scrap out on the curb, Jed? Not bring more of it home." My face burned, but I kept my gaze locked on the auctioneer. The junkyard man looked at me, sized me up, and shook his head. He wasn't going to bid against a farmer who was clearly letting pride get the best of him. 200 go in once, Clyde called, his eyes darting between me and the crowd. Go in twice. He looked at Russ, giving him a chance to run me up, but Russ just shook his head, still laughing. Sold, Clyde banged his fist on his clipboard, to Jedediah Stone for $200. A wave of murmurs washed over the crowd. I heard someone whisper, "He's a bigger fool than I thought." Another said, "His wife Sarah is going to kill him." I ignored them all. I walked up to the auctioneer's table, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and counted out 10 worn $20 bills. The ink on the receipt felt like a brand. I now owned 10 tons of somebody else's problems. As I walked away, Russ clapped me hard on the shoulder. "You enjoy that project, Jed," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "While you're playing with your new toy, I'll be buying up the rest of the county. Progress waits for no man." He winked and walked off toward his shiny truck, the king of the world. I just stood there for a long moment, the receipt in my hand, looking at the mountain of dead steel I had just bought. It was ugly, it was broken, and the whole world thought I was a fool. But as I stared at it, a plan began to form in my mind. A slow, difficult, greasy plan. Now, before we go any further into this story, before I tell you about the nights spent under that machine with grease in my hair and despair in my heart, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever taken a chance on something that everyone else called junk? A car, a tool, a piece of land that nobody else wanted? Drop a comment below and tell me about that one thing you saw potential in when the rest of the world only saw scrap. I'd sure like to hear about it. Getting that Dozer home was the first battle in a long war. $200 bought the machine, but it didn't move it. It sat there at the Miller place like a monument to my own foolishness for 3 days while I figured out a plan. Russ Thorne drove by twice a day, slowing down each time just to make sure it was still there. I didn't own a trailer big enough to haul a feather, let alone a 10-ton crawler. Renting a lowboy and a semi to pull it would cost more than I'd paid for the machine itself. That was out of the question. My only heavy-hauling vehicle was a 1962 International Lodestar 1600, a single-axle grain truck with a creaky wooden bed and a V8 gas engine that was tired from 30 years of hauling corn. It was rated for 5 tons, maybe 6 on a good day. This was double that. The only man in the county with a trailer big enough who might lend it to me was a crusty old farmer named Silas Croft. Silas lived 5 miles down a gravel road and still farmed with a pair of ancient, unstyled John Deere A's. He had an old military surplus trailer he used for moving his own equipment between his scattered fields. It was built during the war to haul tanks, he claimed. It looked it. The tires were cracked, the wooden deck was half-rotted, and it used a simple pintle hook instead of a modern 5th wheel. I found Silas in his shop, grinding a new edge on a plowshare, sparks flying from the stone wheel. He was a man of about 70, with a face like a dried apple and hands as thick and calloused as slabs of bacon. "Heard you bought the old Miller Dozer," he said without looking up from his work, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Word travels fast," I said. "Stupid travels faster," he grunted, shutting off the grinder. The sudden silence was deafening. He turned and wiped his hands on an oily rag. "What do you want, Jedediah?" "I was hoping I could borrow your big trailer to get it home." Silas stared at me for a long time, his pale blue eyes seeming to look right through me. "You aim to pull that thing with your old Lodestar?" I nodded. He actually chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You'll be lucky if you don't snap the frame on that truck, or burn the clutch out, or both." He walked over to a corner of the shop and spat a stream of tobacco juice into a coffee can. "But a man's got a right to his own mistakes. It's out back. Have it back by Saturday, and if you break it, you bought it." The next morning, I hooked the massive lumbering trailer to my International. The pintle hook slammed shut with a clang that sounded final. The weight of the empty trailer alone made the truck's rear springs groan in protest. The 5-mile drive to the Miller farm was a white-knuckle affair, the trailer swaying and bucking behind me. Loading the Dozer was another nightmare. The engine wouldn't run, so I couldn't drive it up. I had to winch it. My truck had no winch. I spent 2 hours rigging up a system of logging chains, pulleys, and a come-along I borrowed from Silas, anchoring the whole mess to a big oak tree. With my wife Sarah steering the Dozer's dead controls, I began the agonizingly slow process of cranking it onto the trailer, one metallic click at a time. The handle of the come-along kicked and bucked, the cable sang with tension, and the whole time I was praying a chain link wouldn't let go and send 10 tons of steel rolling back down the ramps. It took all afternoon. By the time the Dozer was chained down, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the picked-over auction yard. The tires on the International were squat and flattened under the immense load. I looked at the 5 miles of gravel and blacktop between me and my farm, and a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. The trip home was the longest 5 miles of my life. I never got the truck out of second gear. The engine screamed, the temperature gauge creeping steadily toward the red. Every bump in the road sent a bone-jarring shock through the cab. The trailer tires, old and brittle, looked like they might disintegrate at any moment. When I finally turned onto my own lane, the clutch began to slip, the acrid smell of burning friction material filling the air. With one final shuddering lurch, the truck and its impossible burden rolled to a stop in my yard, not 10 feet from the barn door. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died with a hiss of steam. It wouldn't restart. The clutch was gone. For the next year, that Dozer sat. It became a local landmark, a monument to my folly. Russ Thorne started calling my place Jed's Junkyard. The talk in the diner was that I'd finally lost my mind, spending good money on scrap and then ruining my only grain truck to get it home. I spent that winter rebuilding the International's clutch and transmission in the freezing cold of my barn. Every penny I made went into parts. Sarah never complained, but I saw the worry in her eyes. We were eating a lot of potatoes and canned green beans. When spring came, I turned my attention to the Dozer. I started with the engine, the Detroit 6-71. I rigged a chain hoist to a thick oak beam in the barn and over the course of a week managed to pull the massive engine block out of the crawler's frame. It was a greasy, back-breaking job. Once it was on the floor, the real work began. The diagnosis was grim. 2 scored pistons, a cracked liner, and a warped cylinder head. The previous owner had clearly run it low on oil and cooked it. New parts were out of the question. A rebuild kit from the dealer would cost more than a good used tractor. So I became a scavenger. I spent my Saturdays driving to every tractor salvage yard within 100 miles. I crawled over mountains of rusted iron, my knuckles getting scraped and bloody, searching for the guts of dead machines. I found a cylinder head off an old GMC bus in a yard near Des Moines. I pulled 2 pistons and liners from a Detroit that had powered a sawmill until the building burned down around it. They weren't perfect, but they were within tolerance. I spent hours with a micrometer and a set of feeler gauges, measuring, checking, and double-checking. My barn became a machine hospital. I honed the cylinders by hand, cleaned every bolt and nut in a bucket of gasoline, and meticulously reassembled the engine, following the worn pages of a shop manual I'd bought for $2 at a flea market. Nights were spent under a single bare bulb, the smell of grease and solvent clinging to my clothes, my hands stained a permanent black. People driving by would see the light on in my barn late into the night and shake their heads. "There's that fool Jed," they'd say, "still trying to polish that turd." The undercarriage was the next challenge. The sprockets were too worn to save. I couldn't find replacements anywhere. So I did the only thing I could. I took them off, built up the worn teeth with my Lincoln stick welder, bead by painstaking bead, and then spent 40 hours with a heavy-duty angle grinder, shaping each tooth back to its original profile. It was slow, tedious, soul-destroying work. When I was done, my arms and back ached so badly I could barely sleep. But the sprockets were usable. I pressed out the old track pins and bushings with a massive hydraulic press I'd built myself from an old bottle jack and scrap I-beams, replacing them with new ones I'd ordered one at a time as I could afford them. The world outside my barn was changing fast. It was the mid-70s now, and farming was booming. President Nixon had opened up trade with the Soviet Union, and they were buying American grain as fast as we could grow it. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3 almost overnight. Land prices doubled, then tripled. The banks, flush with cash, were practically begging farmers to take out loans. The mantra from the universities and the government was get big or get out. Russell Thorne was getting big. He was the golden boy of the county. He bought the 80 acres to the north of me, paying a price per acre that made old-timers gasp. Then he bought the quarter section to the east. He traded in his 2-year-old John Deeres for brand-new International Harvester 1066, with air-conditioned cabs and radios. He bought a new Gleaner L2 combine, a silver behemoth that could cut 8 rows of corn at a time. My old John Deere 55 could only manage 3. He'd drive by my place in his new Lincoln, a cigar clamped in his teeth, and see me out there, still farming with my old Farmel M, still tinkering with that mountain of yellow rust in my yard. He'd just shake his head and laugh. To him, and to most everyone else, I was a failure. A man stuck in the past, too timid or too stupid to grab the opportunity that was right in front of him. At the co-op, other farmers would clap Russ on the back and then look at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Jed, you've got to get with the times," one of them told me, leaning against a stack of seed bags. "You're sitting on a gold mine with your land. You could borrow against it, buy that piece next to you, get a new tractor. You're letting the parade pass you by." I just nodded. "I like to sleep at night," was all I said. They didn't understand. I saw the rising interest rates. I saw inflation eating away at the dollar. My father had lived through the Depression, and he'd taught me one thing above all else. Debt is a cage. The good times never last, he'd say, but the bank's note always comes due. So while Russ was signing papers and expanding his empire on borrowed money, I was taking my profits from the high grain prices and doing something different. I paid off the last small mortgage on my farm, I bought a better welder for my shop, I replaced the roof on the barn, and I kept a small, solid chunk of cash in a savings account at the bank, earning a pittance in interest but giving me a measure of security that no new tractor could provide. Then, one cool evening in the spring of '75, after nearly 2 years of work, the moment of truth arrived. I had the Detroit diesel back in the Dozer's frame. The fuel lines were bled, the radiator was full, and a fresh battery was hooked up. I climbed into the worn steel seat, took a deep breath, and pushed the starter button. The starter motor groaned, turning the big engine over slowly. 1 revolution, 2. A puff of white smoke coughed from the straight exhaust pipe. I gave it a little shot of ether. The engine spun faster, and then, with a deafening roar, it caught. The ground shook. A thick cloud of black smoke billowed from the stack, blotting out the setting sun. The 2-stroke diesel settled into a rattling, angry idle that sounded like a drum solo in a metal bucket. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I let it warm up, my hand resting on the vibrating gear shift. The oil pressure was good, the temperature was steady. I eased the throttle forward, and the engine's rattle smoothed into a high-pitched scream, a signature Detroit howl that echoed across the valley. I pulled back on the main clutch lever, pushed the shifter into first gear, and let the clutch out. With a lurch and a groan of protesting steel, the 10-ton machine moved forward under its own power for the first time in years. I didn't take it out to the fields. I didn't go looking for dirt work to hire out. My first project was for me. On the back 40 acres of my property was a 20-acre woodlot that had been left to grow wild for 50 years. It was choked with scrub brush, poison ivy, and deadfall. The soil underneath was rich, but the land was useless. For the rest of that summer and into the fall, I spent every spare hour on that dozer. I learned its ways, the feel of the blade biting into the earth, the the sound of the engine under load. I cleared brush, pushed over dead trees, and dug out massive, stubborn stumps that had been there since my grandfather's time. I piled it all into huge heaps to be burned in the winter. It was slow, methodical work. I wasn't acquiring new land. I was improving the land I already owned, making it more productive. I was building equity with sweat, not with a banker's pen. One evening, as dusk was settling, I was finishing up for the day when I saw the headlights of a car stop on the road at the edge of my property. It was Russ Thorne's Lincoln. He got out and stood there, watching me work under the glow of the Dozer's single-functioning headlight. I was pushing a massive oak stump, the engine screaming at full throttle, the tracks digging into the dirt. The old Dozer shuddered and groaned, but it never quit. Slowly, the stump ripped free from the earth with a sound like tearing fabric, its tangled roots reaching for the sky like the arms of a drowning man. I idled the machine down and watched as Russ got back in his car and drove away without a wave. There was no laughter this time, just the quiet hum of his expensive car disappearing into the twilight. The grain prices stayed high through 76 and 77. The boom continued. But there were whispers on the wind, stories on the radio about an oil crisis, about inflation hitting double digits. The Federal Reserve was starting to talk about raising interest rates to cool things down. I'd sit on my porch at night, listening to the crickets and the far-off sound of the highway, and I could feel it. A change in the weather. A storm was coming. I didn't know when or how bad it would be, but I knew it was out there, just over the horizon, and I was doing everything I could to make sure my little farm had a deep enough foundation to withstand the flood. The summer of 1980 arrived like a fever. The sky turned a pale, hazy white and stayed that way for weeks. The corn, which had stood so tall and proud in June, began to curl its leaves inward by mid-July, a desperate attempt to hold on to what little moisture it had. The ponds on my property shrank, their edges cracking into intricate patterns of dried mud. At night, you could feel the heat radiating back up from the baked earth. There was no relief. This was the first crack. The high prices for grain had hidden a multitude of sins, but a drought was a debt collector that couldn't be ignored. My yields would be down, I knew, but my fields, especially the new ground I'd cleared with the Dozer, rich with decades of humus, were holding on better than most. The deep, black soil acted like a sponge. For Russell Thorne, the drought was a catastrophe. His 1,000 acres were mostly rented ground, much of it thinner, hillier soil that turned to powder in the relentless sun. He had invested heavily in a center pivot irrigation system for 1/4 section, a marvel of modern engineering that crawled in a perfect circle, spraying life-giving water. But it ran on a massive diesel generator, and with the price of diesel fuel nearly tripling thanks to the chaos in the Middle East, running it was like setting fire to $100 bills. I could hear the distant thrum of that engine day and night, a constant expensive heartbeat counting down his dwindling operating loan. Then the second crack appeared, a political earthquake that shook the heartland to its core. To punish the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan, the president declared an embargo on grain sales. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. The price of corn at the local elevator collapsed from over $3 a bushel to barely $2, and it was still falling. Farmers who had stored their grain, gambling on even higher prices, were wiped out. The final blow came not from the sky or from Washington, but from the banks. To fight the runaway inflation that was strangling the country, the Federal Reserve cranked interest rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. The prime rate, the number that governed every other loan, soared past 15, then 18, then an almost unbelievable 20%. For me, it was an abstract number in the newspaper. My farm was paid for, my equipment was mine, my operating capital for the year was in a savings account, not a banker's ledger. But for Russ Thorne and thousands like him, that number was a dagger. His entire empire was built on variable rate loans. His payments didn't just go up, they exploded. The cost of the money he had borrowed to buy land and machinery more than doubled overnight. The first time I saw the real fear in his eyes was in late August, at the parts counter of the John Deere dealership. I was there to buy a gasket for the water pump on my 4020. The part cost $7. Russ was there ahead of me, his face pale and slick with sweat, despite the air conditioning. He was talking to the service manager, his voice low and tight. "What do you mean you can't get one?" he was saying. "It's a hydraulic pump for an 8630. You sell the damn things." The manager, a man named Dave who had known us both since we were kids, looked miserable. "I'm sorry, Russ. The computer says it's on back order from the factory. Could be 2 weeks, could be a month. The strikes, the economy, everything's a mess." Russ slammed his fist on the counter. The metal parts bins behind it rattled. "A month?" "Dave, my beans are ready now. That tractor is the only thing big enough to pull my new disc. I've got to get the ground worked for wheat as soon as the beans are off. I can't wait a month." "I can call some other dealers for you," Dave offered weakly. "I've already called them," Russ snapped. "Nobody has one." He turned away from the counter, running a hand through his hair, and saw me standing there. For a second, the old arrogance flared. Then, just as quickly, it died, replaced by a look of raw, naked desperation. He just shook his head and walked out, the bell over the door chiming his exit. His new, powerful, technologically advanced tractor was useless, defeated by a single unavailable part. A few days later, I saw him working that same field with a smaller, older tractor he'd been forced to rent at an exorbitant daily rate, trying to keep up. He was losing money with every turn of the wheel. The cracks were spreading through his empire like fissures in dry earth. I heard he'd sold off his herd of feeder cattle at a loss just to make a payment on his land. His new Gleaner combine sat idle for 3 critical days of the corn harvest, waiting on a specialized bearing that had to be flown in from Illinois. My old John Deere 55 broke down twice that harvest, but both times I had it running again within hours, using parts I either had on the shelf or could get from the local auto supply. The change was most visible in his face. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a permanent grim set of his jaw. The confidence that had radiated from him like heat from a furnace was gone, replaced by the haunted, hunted look of a man who hears footsteps behind him in the dark. He stopped coming to the diner for coffee in the mornings. His shiny Lincoln was now perpetually coated in a layer of dust. The king was losing his kingdom, and the whole county was watching it happen. The winter of 1981 was bleak. The snow came early and stayed late, a thick white blanket covering a landscape of quiet desperation. It wasn't just Russ Thorne. All around us, the fabric of our community was tearing. The local paper, once filled with stories of record yields and farm expansions, was now a weekly chronicle of sorrow. Tucked in the classifieds, between ads for used cars and church bake sales, were the notices. Small black-bordered boxes of dense legal type. Notice of sheriff's sale. Miller's Farm, the Jansen Place, Old Man Hemlock's quarter section. Names I had known my entire life, families who had worked this soil for generations, were being wiped off the map. The auctions that followed were grim affairs. There was no festive atmosphere, no friendly bidding wars. Just silent, grim-faced men in insulated coveralls, watching as their neighbors' lives were sold off for pennies on the dollar. The buyers were often strangers in new sedans, representatives from insurance companies or investment groups from Chicago, acquiring land at rock-bottom prices. Each farm that fell to an outsider felt like a death in the family. Russ Thorne held on longer than most. He was a fighter, I'll give him that. He sold one of his new tractors. He let go of 200 acres of rented ground. He worked from before sunrise to long after sunset, his face etched with exhaustion. But it was like trying to bail out the ocean with a bucket. The interest on his loans was compounding faster than he could possibly pay it down, and the value of the land he'd used as collateral was plummeting. He was trapped. The inevitable notice appeared in the paper on a cold Thursday in March. The bank was foreclosing. The entire Russell Thorne operation, the 1,000 acres, the house his grandfather had built, the new machine shed, the entire fleet of modern iron, was to be sold at public auction on the first Saturday in April. When the day came, it was cold and grey, with a raw wind that cut through your coat. It felt like the whole county was there, standing in the muddy yard in front of Russ's massive machine shed. It was a mirror image of the Miller auction all those years ago, but magnified tenfold. Instead of one over-leveraged combine, here was a line of gleaming machines that represented millions of dollars in borrowed capital. 2 International 1066, A John Deere 8630 four-wheel drive, the big Gleaner combine with its corn and bean heads sitting beside it like loyal dogs. It was the most impressive lineup of farm equipment ever assembled in our county, and it was all being sold to satisfy a debt. I saw Russ standing by himself near the house, his shoulders slumped. His wife was beside him, her arm linked through his, her face a stoic mask that couldn't quite hide the pain in her eyes. He looked 10 years older than he had the last time I'd seen him. He wasn't the cocky king of progress anymore, he was just another man who had gambled and lost. I stayed near the back, just as I had before. My presence felt ghoulish, but I had to be there. This was the final chapter of a story we had all been a part of. The auctioneer, the same Clyde from all those years ago, started with the small items, but the crowd was restless. They were waiting for the main event. The land. Finally, Clyde climbed onto the bed of a pickup truck with a microphone. "All right, folks," he said, his voice tinny in the cold air. "Now we're going to sell the real estate. We're offering it as one parcel, 962 tillable acres, with house, barns, and grain bins. A turnkey operation for the modern farmer." A man from the bank stepped up and read the opening bid, a number that was shockingly low, but still astronomical for anyone in the crowd. Silence fell. No local farmer could touch it. The only people who could afford a sum like that weren't here to farm. They were here to invest. "I have an opening bid from the AgriVest Corporation of Illinois," Clyde announced. He looked around the crowd. "Do I hear another bid?" More silence. You could hear the wind whistling around the corner of the barn. This was it. The Thorn Farm, a piece of our county for 3 generations, was about to become a line item on a corporate balance sheet, managed from an office 1,000 miles away. I felt a nudge in my gut. It wasn't pride, it wasn't pity, it was something else. A sense of duty, maybe. A feeling that some things were worth more than their market price. I thought of the 20 acres I had cleared with my old Dozer. That land was mine in a way Russ's had never been his. It was paid for in sweat and grease, not interest and principal. I thought of my father and his warnings about debt. I took a deep breath of the cold air and started walking forward. The crowd parted for me. I walked right up to the pickup truck and looked up at Clyde. "I can't bid on the whole thing," I said, my voice steady and clear. "But the law says you have to offer it in parcels if a buyer requests it. I want to bid on parcel 3, the original homestead, 160 acres with the house and the old barn." A murmur went through the crowd. The man from the bank strode over, his face a thundercloud. "That's highly irregular. We want to sell it as a single unit." "It's the law," I repeated, my eyes not leaving his. I knew it was. An old statute designed to help families keep at least a piece of their land. The banker and the auctioneer had a frantic, whispered conversation. Finally, Clyde shrugged. "Folks, we have a request to sell parcel 3 separately, 160 acres, the original Thorn homestead." He named a price. The man from AgriVest, a slick-looking fellow in a cashmere coat, made a bid. I counted it. I used the cash I had carefully saved over the last decade, the profits from the good years that I hadn't poured into new iron or more land. It was every penny I had, a nest egg I'd planned to use for my own retirement. We went back and forth. He was bidding with a pen. I was bidding with my life savings. The crowd was dead silent, watching. Finally, I made my last best offer. It was a stretch. It would leave me with nothing in the bank. But it was a number I could live with, a price I could pay in cash that day. The man in the cashmere coat looked at his clipboard, did some math, and shook his head. For his corporation, it was just a number. If it went too high, the return on investment wasn't there. He was done. "Going once," Clyde called out, looking at me. "Going twice." His eyes swept the crowd one last time. "Sold to Jedediah Stone." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I owned the heart of the Thorn family farm. I turned and looked back at Russ. He was staring at me, his expression a mixture of shock, confusion, and something I couldn't quite read. I just gave him a slow nod, then turned and walked to the auctioneer's trailer to sign the papers and write the biggest check of my life. I didn't stay for the rest of it. I didn't want to watch them sell off his magnificent machines. I had done what I came to do. Later that evening, after the last of the buyers had gone and an eerie silence had fallen over the farm, I drove back over. The yard was a mess of muddy tracks. The big machine shed stood open and empty, a hollow carcass. I found Russ sitting on the back step of the house that was now legally mine, staring out at the fields. He didn't look up when I approached. "Come to gloat, Jed?" he asked, his voice rough. "Come to tell me I told you so?" I sat down on the step beside him. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun set behind the bare trees. The sky was streaked with purple and orange. "No," I said finally. "I came to make you an offer." He snorted. "I've got nothing left to sell." "This isn't about buying," I said. "I don't want your house, Russ. I don't want your granddad's land. I just want to see it farmed right. I want you and your family to stay here. You can rent it from me. A third of the crop goes to me for the deed and the taxes. The other 2/3 is yours. We'll work it together. My old equipment, your young back, and when you get on your feet again, you can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it today." Not a penny more. He finally turned to look at me. His eyes were red-rimmed, but for the first time that day, they weren't empty. He was searching my face, looking for the catch, the angle. He found none. "Why?" he whispered. "After all the years I laughed at you, called you a fool. Why would you do this?" I looked out at the darkening fields. I thought about that old Dozer, sitting in my barn, its engine quiet, its work done for now. I thought about how it had looked like junk to everyone else. But to me, it had looked like a chance. "Because this isn't Chicago," I said quietly. "We're neighbors, and this land remembers your family's name. It ought to keep remembering it." He didn't say anything for a long time. He just put his head in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. I sat there with him, a silent witness, as the last light of the day faded from the sky. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip. Russ and I became partners, an unlikely pairing of old iron and new ideas. He taught me about new hybrid seeds, and I taught him how to rebuild a carburetor. We farmed my land and his old homestead together. He was a changed man, quieter, more thoughtful, with a deep-seated respect for the unforgiving math of farming. 5 years later, he bought the first 40 acres back. 10 years after the auction, he made the final payment, and the deed to his family's home was back in his name. We shook hands over the hood of my old International truck, two middle-aged farmers who had been to hell and back in different ways. My own son, Ben, grew up during those years. He was a quiet boy, with my hands and his mother's thoughtful eyes. He spent his childhood in my shop, learning the smell of grease and hot metal. He didn't have the fire for expansion that had consumed Russ, but he had a deep love for the land and a fascination with the mechanics of the machines that worked it. One Saturday afternoon, when Ben was about 16, I found him in the barn, staring at the old Alice Chalmers Dozer. It was faded and scarred, but it was clean and well-maintained. It still did heavy work for me every few years, clearing a fence line or digging a new waterway. "Tell me again, Dad," he said, running his hand over the cold steel of the blade. "Why did you buy this thing? Everyone said you were crazy." I leaned against the massive track, the steel cool through my shirt. I could hear the sound of Russ's not-so-new-anymore tractor working in the field next door, a steady, productive hum. Everyone else saw a pile of junk, I told him. They saw a broken-down engine and a worn-out undercarriage. They saw a problem that would cost more to fix than it was worth. I paused, looking at my son, wanting him to understand the heart of it all. "But I saw a tool," I continued, "a way to build something real, something that would last, without owing my soul to a bank. This machine didn't build an empire, son. It cleared 20 acres of woods that helped us survive a drought. It taught me patience. It taught me that progress isn't always about getting bigger. Sometimes it's about getting stronger, digging your foundations deeper. This Dozer didn't make me rich. It made me independent. And independence is the only thing that will hold when the floods come." Ben nodded, a slow understanding dawning on his face. He climbed up into the operator's seat, his hands falling naturally onto the worn steel levers. "Think you could show me how to adjust the clutch on this thing?" he asked. I smiled. "I think I can do that," I said, reaching for a wrench. "Let's get to work." The late afternoon sun slanted through the open barn door, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, the corn stood green and tall against the blue Iowa sky. The world had changed, but here, in the quiet of the barn, surrounded by the tools and the machines that had seen us through, the important things remained the same.